Okay. Hi, everybody. Let me make sure I'm recording this. Maybe it's just going to record automatically. Okay. This is my first time trying to just record straight onto YouTube rather than recording a video separately. So, welcome to my experiment. I've just finished reading all of your comments in the discussion section, and I apologize for being a little bit late with this weekend reflection. I've been sick the past few days and just sort of coming out of it, but it was a nice treat to get to read your discussions in the forum. So, the first main thought I have is just that I appreciate the thoughtfulness with which you're making your comments and also weighing in on each other's thoughts. So far, so good, just from a perspective of the assignment. But then, in terms of the content, a number of really interesting issues were raised, and I just wanted to touch on a couple of them. Lauren, I think, raised the issue that you might almost acquire a pessimistic attitude about peer review, so that if you're planning on submitting work of your own, for example, you might think it's not going to be a helpful process, or maybe you're just going to get some biased review and you have no idea whether it will be something that actually supports your work. And I want to say there is some hope here. So as you gain experience and expertise in a field and you submit papers to journals, over time, you'll begin to acquire an intuitive and an informed sense of which journals really do tend to have better peer review processes than others. A lot of it depends on the culture of the editorial team, the leadership of the editor in chief, and also the decision making sophistication of the associate editors at a given journal, the ones who actually make the decision to send the paper out for review, which people to send it out to. And so there's a whole set of principles that associate editors can be better or worse at handling themselves to make sure that they're making sophisticated judgments. And so what you'll find just through trial and error, really, and perhaps also through reputation, if you find that you're working in a research community where you acquire the ability to make expert judgments about one another's work and you get a sense of who are the people who are doing reliable work and you ask them where they submit their work to. I will say that over time, I mean, you shouldn't despair. You can acquire a sense of which journals, which editors are the ones who seem to be, in some sense, taking their job seriously and doing it competently. So, you know, when you're outside of the scientific community and you're a layperson, or say you're a bioethicist who doesn't, submit scientific studies yourself, the trouble here is that you won't have that firsthand experience. You won't be submitting a bunch of papers to different journals and getting running your own experiment in the sense of getting feedback on papers and seeing whether the feedback is really constructive, whether the person has clearly paid attention to the details, whether they know the references that you're citing, and so forth. So this brings me to some other points that some of you made, which is, well, look, peer review has its problems, but surely it's better than nothing, and that's probably true. On balance, I would say that peer review at least tends to lend itself towards some amount of quality control. The challenge from the outsider perspective, so when you're not the scientist actually submitting the work yourself, is that it's very hard to know in any given instance or with any given journal whether that journal or that set of editors is on the quality control side of the spectrum or more on the bias and um, you know attracting reviewers who are just doing a bit of a sloppy job. And so this is a broader point for the course. Um, we may have some insight into how something should work in principle. We may think that if it's working well, it would go this way rather than that way. But often when we're scholars who are not experts in a given area, or we're lay people, or we're journalists, or we're policymakers, we might not be in a position to know where we are on that spectrum of quality when we're reading a given paper or looking at the work of a given journal. So, just to summarize those 2 points, you shouldn't despair if you're in the position of submitting work to journals, because over time, as you advance in your career and through talking with others whom you trust and building a network of epistemic trust, people that you can tell based on the quality of the questions they ask at seminars and based on the strength of the arguments that they make in areas of the literature that you know well or that you've come to know well, you can over time get a sense of who do you want to affiliate with, because they seem to be reliably doing good work, they seem to have integrity, they seem to really care about getting things right. And then you can rely on this network of trust to make decisions about which journals are the ones you should submit to, or which journals are the ones that seem to be pretty reliably publishing papers that you know hold water when you really critically evaluate them. The challenge, though, is when you're not doing that, when you're not on the scientific side of things, when you're a consumer or reader or journalist who's trying to get a sense of what's going on in science, then you don't have that privileged access to a network of trust that allows you to make these kinds of determinations. And so that's something that I just wanted to flag as an issue that's maybe somewhat still unresolved based on the conversations that you all were having. Another thing I was pleased to see was that you evaluated some of these critiques of science with a critical lens. So I was really happy to see that in discussing the Smith piece in particular, so I'm clearly focusing on the peer review discussion. Some of you pointed out that, well, he sort of seems to be relying on anecdotes, or I see that he cited a couple of other sources, but he did it in a sort of haphazard way. It's not clear how systematic his appraisal is of the literature. He seems to have some position of authority in that he was responsible for editing the BMJ for many years, and so he has firsthand experience. But you were right to point out that the piece itself is sort of an opinion piece. Who knows whether it was carefully peer reviewed or whether Richard Smith has latitude to say what it is that he thinks on this topic because he's in a senior position in the publishing world. And so this will definitely be a theme of the course. I'm going to be providing you with readings, most of which are of a high quality and ones that I think are making an important point. Sometimes I've selected readings because they're maybe shorter, so that this is not to overload you with a really long and exhaustive study on something. And so you will have to make this judgment about, for each assignment, for each reading that I give you, is it living up to its own criteria? Is it presenting arguments and citing papers in as rigorous a way as it should, given the critical stance that it may be taking on science as an enterprise or as an institution. So good on you for those of you who brought your skeptical lens even to the papers that are themselves purporting to be skeptical. I think it's got to be, in some sense, critical analysis all the way down. And as some of you pointed out, you just have to sort of develop your own capacities to do critical research and to think clearly and to be aware of the fact that you can't necessarily take something just based on a heuristic. Well, it's peer reviewed, therefore it's reliable. Over time, I think what we'll learn in this course is that some of these things maybe count as broad heuristics, where in general, if something's peer reviewed and it comes from a well-known journal, it's probably going to be better than a random blog post that you found on Facebook. So some of these heuristics work at the 10,000-foot level in terms of basically orienting yourself to what's likely to be a more reliable source. But when it comes to things that are politicized, when it comes to things where there's an inconsistent evidence base, when it comes to things where it's maybe polarized between different just actors within the research community, these are the harder cases where you see these heuristics may start to break down. I mean, sometimes you'll have somebody with specialist knowledge who publishes critiques on their blog that are in some cases much more sophisticated than what might be published in a given journal, and you have to sort of learn these things over time. Who's reliable? So those are my main thoughts. Let me see if I wrote anything else down here that I wanted to bring up. Um, yeah, just the final point is that, as some of you pointed out, if we want science to be a trustworthy institution, the first step is to acknowledge the weaknesses in it. And sometimes within science, there's a tendency toward wagon circling, where it's like, look, we need the public to trust what we say. You've got these flat earthers, and you've got the creationists who don't, believe in evolutionary theory, and you've got the vaccine skeptics and so forth. So the main thing we need to do is just really insist that the public, trust us as scientists. When we say something, that should be said confidently, and we should expect the public to fall in line. And as some of you are pointing out, this is a risky strategy. A bunch of the public is pretty discerning, and they can usually tell when they're being talked down to or when they're being exhorted to just sort of take whatever's the latest consensus. When you have enough of the public that's reasonably discerning, those kinds of rhetorical bullying strategies aren't going to work so much. And so instead, you have to turn the critical lens in on yourself and on your community of practice and say, well, do we deserve the trust of the public? Do we have institutions, procedures, protocols in place to make sure that the incentives are aligned with what's likeliest to get us to the truth, or that which we have most reason to believe, versus that which is most expedient, or which makes the most money, or which allows a product to be approved more quickly than it would otherwise. And my own reading of the literature and my own experience working in scientific spaces for a long time is that it's not clear how much trust is warranted in the medical establishment. But I believe in the potential of science and medicine. I believe in the potential of science to answer questions in ways that are, you know, superior to guesswork or hearsay or just appeals to tradition or speculation or whatever it is. So, the ideal of science is something that I really believe in and that I strive to uphold in my own work. But science and practice, I think, if we want to get it closer to that ideal so that the trust in science is warranted, the first step, as some of you pointed out, is to take a cold, clear look at the ways in which it's really not working up to that level right now. So we're going to take more of that approach rather than a wagon circling approach in this course. We're going to take a critical lens. But the point of this should be not to collapse into a kind of nihilism or, never-ending skepticism about the possibility of gaining any kind of foothold of knowledge on the world. The point of this is a step along the way to trying to make sure that science is as good as it can be. Because to quote a line from Churchill, it's the worst way of getting a handle on the truth compared to all the other ways that have been tried. So this is a quote about democracy that Churchill once said. He said, "Democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others that have been tried." And science is sort of like that. It's like science is flawed in a lot of ways, and so it's not something that we can just have I don't know, a naive view about. But compared to all the other ways of systematically building knowledge, testing theories, subjecting ideas to critical scrutiny, and so forth, science as an ideal is the best we have. And so I think, partly for that reason, we need to hold it to a very high standard and be frank and honest with ourselves as scientists and scholars, but also to some extent to the public. We need to have a certain level of openness and transparency about where the problems are and also the efforts that are being made to fix them. And then, there has to be some accountability to the public about whether science is living up to its promise, rather than just being a priestly class that gets to decide amongst itself what the truth is and then expect the public to fall in line. So those are just some of my reflections. No particular lecture content here other than a response to some of the really interesting thoughts that you raised in your own communications. And then you'll see I've got a couple of other links from a podcast interview I did some years ago that was about this replication crisis. And so what you'll see there is more substantively what my take is, my appraisal is of some of the types of issues that you're reading about this week. Um, I look forward to seeing your comments this coming week, and I'll also pretty soon send a calendar around to allow us to schedule like a one-on-one kind of coffee date, albeit over Zoom, just so that you can get to know me and I can get to know you, and it won't be totally asynchronous and impersonal. It's good to have some, face-to-face contact and get a sense of what motivates you, what you're curious about, what you're concerned about, and so forth. And so we'll be making some time for that in the coming weeks. All right, keep up the good work.